angry. You're too sensitive. You're far too loud. Calm down. There's no need to take it personally. So, I took in a deep breath and I counted till 10. Now, I'm not only angry, but I'm also excellent at math. So, if anger were an exercise, I would have abs by now. So growing up, around me, I used to see, even as a young adult, I used to see people getting privileges and respect. And I would keep guessing, what is it that I could change, What is it? Should I change my job, my choices, my career, what? But it was a game I could never win because there was no goal. It didn't exist. And the rules of this game were updated daily without notice. You see, as kids, we are conditioned to be good. And anger is never really mentioned openly, loudly, or even foisted upon us as a value. And you realize, though, it is reinforced in 1,000 small ways. When you've argued with your teacher, or you've stood up to that popular kid in school, or if you've just scowled or shouted, there is a label that is coming and dancing its way to you. And no one is standing over there to say, oh, how wonderfully calm you are, when you're being disrespected. So you start to judge yourself like the others do too, because your good qualities are taken for granted. They're not mentioned, and there is no discussion of them. They're ignored. And once you start judging yourself as the others do too, the beginnings of a core belief are planted. Now, believing that something is wrong with you is a slippery slope, and trying to fix it is a folly. I believed that anger would isolate me. I was scared of rejection. I was terrified of losing emotional control, and I was petrified of being abandoned. So what did I do? I decided I won't be angry. I'm not going to be angry. So when I got angry, I suppressed, I ignored, I smiled, and I would cry in private, but I never addressed it. What happened then? Anger is not going to go away, but I was living in denial because I had to prove to those out there that, see, I'm a wonderful person. I don't get angry. I'm good enough. And from that standpoint stemmed all my decisions, my relationships, my work decisions, in fact, every big and small decision of my life, all the good and bad decisions of my life. Till anger had had enough. And one fine day, it showed up in the ugliest way possible, that of explosive rage. And in that red, all-consuming, powerful haze of anger, I lost some wonderful people. And I didn't understand it. I didn't recognize it, So I spiraled into shame. And then I fought harder to suppress it. And that tussle continued till I succeeded. I suppressed anger. Now it didn't come anymore knocking on my doors, but instead it started housing itself in me. And over a period of time, it started to kill my good parts, my fearlessness, my spontaneity, it slowly started to poison my soul. And the fact that I believed that whatever that went wrong around me was in fact my fault was itself crippling to any sort of change that I could try to muster. And I started observing people minutely, even trying to ascertain if their breathing has shifted. Do I need to apologize? Are they angry with me? I hadn't even noticed that I was not the angry one anymore. I was in fact the one who was afraid that the others were angry with me. All I wanted was validation. Validation that I was good enough. But what I didn't know then was this, that validation had to first come from me. And the truth has a strange way of proclaiming itself. One fine day I was filling out a form where I had to describe myself informally, and I had no clue. I had no words to describe myself. I had no clue who I was. That realization stumped me. I mean, my inner dialogue with myself had stopped and I hadn't even noticed. It was shattering, and it was almost as if, you know, the core belief that I'm not good enough, you know, it was acting out. It had ingrained its tentacles into me so deeply that my spirit seemed to be giving up. And that was when my nervous system said enough, and it declared war. And so my body gave up and I fainted. It was as if my body was kicking out all the squatters, you know, the monster of niceness, the ogre of pleasing everyone, the witch of smiling through pain, and hounds of tolerance. When I woke up, it was as if a mist had cleared for me. There was no fear, only clarity. My anger was my soul talking to me, my spirit begging me to listen, that I'd been ignoring since forever. So I stayed and I listened to my anger, you know, and because something inside me had fought its way to consciousness and clarity, and it was both emotional and physical. And I was going to make damn sure I held on to it, not going to let go. My anger was like that disgruntled employee that has filed repeated complaints with management. It was not a villain, but it had been ignored when I had been disrespected, when I had been scared, when I had been that proverbial doormat. You know, I had ignored it. And my core belief that something is wrong with me had acted as the foundation from which fear and disrespect had ruled me. So my anger and my oversensitivity weren't really my flaws, you know. They were a signal that something was wrong and needed to be addressed. There was nothing wrong with me. But then why was I living like there was? You know? And at that minute, I made a decision to listen to myself. And for the first time in years, I started talking to myself. And there was a sense of deep remorse and regret. There was no shame. That was a bolt, no shame. Wow. And I sat up straighter. I could hear my nervous system chuckling in the background. Hey, you seem to be getting it, it was saying, you know. So for the longest time, you know, I'd been told, you're too angry, you're too sensitive, you're far too much. And I realized that, you know, anger is not always the problem. It is like that emotional notification. You know, ignoring it is not going to make it disappear. But it's going to continue buzzing in the background. And the good part about this is that once you address it, you know, it is going to talk to you. It is going to tell you about what needs to change. A surprising development has happened with me. Now anger doesn't show up. It comes as a reminder now and then when I tend to move away from who I am. And today, that is the standpoint that all my life really stems from. You know, I've realized that anger is, it tells us when something is wrong. It tells us when we are moving away from who we are. And you know, we are good and we are enough. And just by that, we are unique. It's like DNA. So the next time someone tells you, you know, you're too angry, you're too much, you're too sensitive, you're too intense, you know, the question to ask is how not to be those things. Because you really can't shrink yourself or morph yourself into somebody who is not you. But the question to ask is, what if those things are your strengths? You know, what if your being too much is your compass? What if your sensitivity is your depth? What if your intensity is your conviction? And what if your anger is your boundary keeper? you know. So, for the longest time, I used to believe that my biggest flaw was my anger. But I realize now that my biggest flaw was believing that I was flawed. And the moment I stopped fighting or amputating those parts that were really just trying to protect me, I became whole. I stopped being less. And that is what Flossom means to me. Not perfection, not being polished, and certainly not being endlessly pleasant, but honest, integrated, and aligned. Flossom is when you stop fighting those parts of yourself that were really just trying to protect you. Flossom is when you realize that the things that you called your flaws, your so-called flaws, are really just your strengths without permission. So the next time when someone tells you, you're too much, you smile and you say, no, I'm just enough. Thank you.